here we are, last chapter. Let's see how it ends. When we last left, Uncle Henrik had given Anne-Marie a lot of information about what they were doing, and Anne-Marie asked if she would ever see Ellen again, and Uncle Henrik said, "You will, little one. You saved her life after all. Some day she will find you again. Someday the war will end. All wars do." So chapter 17, all this long time. The war would end. Uncle Henrik had said that, and it was true. The war ended almost 2 long years later. Anne-Marie was 12. Church bells rang all over Copenhagen early that May evening. The Danish flag was raised everywhere. People stood in the streets and wept as they sang the national anthem of Denmark. Anne-Marie stood on the balcony of the apartment with her parents and sisters and watched. Up and down the street and across the other side, she could see flags and banners in almost every window. She knew that many of those apartments were empty. For nearly 2 years now, neighbors had tended the plants and dusted the furniture and polished the candlesticks for the Jews who had fled. Her mother had done so for the Rosens. "It's what friends do," Mama had said. Now neighbors had entered each unoccupied waiting apartment, opened a window, and hung the symbol of freedom there. This evening, Mrs. Johansson's face was wet with tears. Kirsty, waving a small flag, sang. Her blue eyes were bright. Even Kirsty was growing up. No longer was she the light-hearted chatterbox of a child. Now she was taller, more serious, very thin. She looked like the pictures of Lise at 7 in the old photo album. Peter Nielsen was dead. It was a painful fact to recall on this day when there was so much joy in Denmark. But Anne-Marie forced herself to think of her red-headed almost brother and how devastating the day was when they received the news that Peter had been captured and executed by the Germans in the public square in Copenhagen. He had written a letter to them from prison the night before he was shot. It had said simply that he loved them, that he was not afraid, and that he was proud to have done what he could do for his country and for the sake of all the people he had helped. He had asked in the letter to be buried beside Lise. Even that was not to be for Peter. The Nazis refused to return the bodies of the young men shot. They simply buried them where they were killed and marked the graves only with numbers. Later, Anne-Marie had gone to the place where her parents, with her parents, and laid flowers there on the bleak, numbered ground. That night, Anne-Marie's parents told her the truth about Lisa's death at the beginning of the war. She was part of the resistance too, Papa had explained. She was part of the group that fought for our country in whatever ways they could. "We didn't know," Mama said. "She didn't tell us. Peter told us after she died." "Oh, Papa and Mama," Anne-Marie cried. "They didn't shoot Lise, did they? The way they shot Peter, in the public square with people watching?" She wanted to know it all, but wasn't certain that she could bear the truth. But Papa shook his head. No, she was with Peter and the others in a cellar where they held secret meetings to make plans. Somehow, the Nazis found out, and they raided their place that evening. They all ran in different directions, trying to escape. Some of them were shot, Mama told her sadly. Peter was shot in the arm. Do you remember that Peter's arm was bandaged in a sling at Lisa's funeral? He wore a coat over it so that no one would notice, and a hat to hide his red hair. The Nazis were looking for him. Anne-Marie did not remember that. She hadn't noticed. The whole day had been a blur of grief. But what about Lise? If she wasn't shot, what happened to her? From the military car, they saw her running, and they simply ran her down. "So it was true what you said, that she was hit by a car?" "Yes," Papa told her. "That was true." "They were all so young," Mama said, shaking her head. She blinked and closed her eyes for a moment, took a long, deep breath. They were so very, very young, with so much hope. Now, remembering Lise, Anne-Marie looked from the balcony down into the street. She saw that below, amid music, singing, and the sound of church bells, people were dancing. It brought back another memory, the memory of Lise so long ago wearing the yellow dress, dancing with Peter on the night they announced their engagement. She turned and went to her bedroom, where the blue trunk still stood in the corner, as it had all these years. Opening it, Anne-Marie saw that the yellow dress had begun to fade. It was discolored at the edges, where it had lain folded for so long. Carefully, she spread open the skirt of the dress and found the place where Ellen's necklace was hidden in the pocket. The little Star of David still gleamed gold. "Papa," she said, returning to the balcony where her father was standing with the others, watching the rejoicing crowd. She opened her hand and she showed him the necklace. "Can you fix this? I've kept it all this long time. It is Ellen's." Her father took it from her, examined the broken clasp. "Yes," he said, "I can fix it. And when the Rosens come home, you can give it back to Ellen. Until then," Anne-Marie told him, "I will wear it myself." So, the afterword. How much of this story is true? I knew you would ask me that. Let me tell you, here, where fact ends and fiction begins. Anne-Marie is a child of my imagination, though she grew from stories told to me by my friend Annalise Platt, to whom this book is dedicated, who was herself a child in Copenhagen during those long years of German occupation. I was always fascinated and moved by Anne-Marie's descriptions, not only of personal deprivation that their family and neighbors suffered and the sacrifices they made, but even more by the greater picture she drew for me of courage and integrity of the Danish people under the leadership of the king they loved so much, Christian X. So I created little Anne-Marie and her family, and I set them down in Copenhagen in an apartment on a street where I have walked myself, and I imagined their life against real events of 1943. Denmark surrendered to Germany in 1940, that is true. It is true for some reasons that Papa explained to Anne-Marie. The country was small and undefended and had no army. The people would have been destroyed had they tried to defend themselves against the huge German forces. So surely, with great sorrow, King Christian surrendered, and overnight the soldiers moved in. From then on, for 5 years, they occupied the country. Visible on almost every street corner, always armed and spit-shined, they controlled the newspapers, the rail system, the government, the schools, the hospitals, and the day-to-day existence of the Danish people. But they never controlled King Christian. It is true that he rode alone on his horse from the palace every morning, unguarded, to greet his people. And though it seemed so charming as to be a flight of the author's fancy, the story that Papa told Anne-Marie of the soldier who asked the Danish soldier, "Who is that man?" The story is recorded in one of the documents that will still remain for all that time. Remember that story? The little boy said, "Who is that man?" And the answer was, "It's the king of Denmark." And they said, "Well, where are his soldiers? Where are his guards?" And the father said, "All of Denmark are his guards." That was a sweet story. It is true that in August of 1943, the Danes sank their own entire navy in the Copenhagen harbor as the Germans approached to take over the ships for their own use. My friend Annalise remembers that, and many who were children at the time would have been awakened, as Kirsty was, by explosions and fiercely lighted skies as the ship burned. On New Year's of Jewish holidays in 1943, those who gathered to worship at the synagogue in Copenhagen, as the fictional Rosens did, were warned by the rabbi that they were going to be taken and relocated by the Jews. The rabbi knew because the high German official told the Danish government, who passed the information along to the leaders of the Jewish community. The name of that German was G.F. Duckwitz, and I hope that even today, so many years later, there are flowers on his grave because this man showed compassion and courage. And so all the Jews, all but a few who didn't believe the warning, fled. They fled into the arms of the Danes, who took them in and fed them and clothed them and hid them and helped them get to Sweden. In the weeks following the Jewish New Year, almost the entire Jewish population of Denmark, nearly 7,000 people, was smuggled across the sea to Sweden. A little hand-hemmed linen handkerchief that Anne-Marie carried to her uncle. Was that true? Surely something that was made up by the author who wanted to create a heroine out of a fictional little girl. No, that handkerchief is part of history. After the Nazis began to use police dogs to sniff out hidden passengers on fishing boats, the Swedish scientists worked swiftly to prevent such detection. They created a powerful powder composed of dried rabbit's blood and cocaine. The blood attracted the dogs, and when they sniffed it, the cocaine numbed their noses and destroyed their sense of smell temporarily. Almost every boat captain used this handkerchief, and many lives were saved. The secret operations that saved the Jews were orchestrated by the Danish resistance, which, like all resistance movements, was composed of very young and very brave young men and women. Peter Nielsen, though he is fictional, represents these courageous and idealistic young people, so many of whom died at the hands of the enemy. In reading the resistant leaders of Denmark, I came across an account of a young man named Kim Braun, who was eventually captured and executed by the Nazis when he was 21. I read his story as I had read many others, turning the pages, skimming here and there. After a while, even courage becomes routine to the reader. Though quite unprepared, I turned the page and faced the photograph of Kim Braun. He wore a turtleneck sweater, his thick light hair was windblown, his eyes looked out at me, unwavering from the page. Seeing him there, so terribly young, broke my heart. But seeing the quiet determination in his boyish eyes made me determined to tell his story, and to tell all the Danish people who shared his dreams. So I would like to end this with a paragraph written by that young man in a letter to his mother the night before he was put to death. This is what he wrote. And I want you all to remember that you must not dream yourselves back to the times before the war, but dream for all of you, young and old, must be to create an ideal of human decency and not a narrow-minded, prejudiced one. That is the greatest gift our country hungers for, something every little peasant boy can look forward to, and with pleasure feel that he is part of something he can work and fight for. Surely that gift, the gift of a world of human decency, is one that all countries hunger for. I hope this story of Denmark and its people will remind us that such a world is possible. The end.